process like you do here in Jeff City. It's like, we got to get through this year on policy. We got to get through this year on budget process. I encourage all of you to look 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. Where do you see this state being? That's what leadership is about. That's why you're in here today. It's because you care enough to come to this event. And I think one thing I will assure you, if we will find common ground and work together, we can move the needle. I know you can do that just by doing some of the programs we're doing now and seeing the outcome. But again, it all starts those early ages. We're trying to fix it on the back end. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to thank on the National Legislative State Council for everything they do, and you'll find out more and more as you go through it. You can use that for a tool when it comes to policy, much outside early childhood development. But I think you will see some significant changes without saying too much here. You'll hear some more things in the state of state, so it's important you listen to the state of state. This year in Missouri, I want you to listen to that for a little while, but I want you to hear what we're doing on early childhood development, that we are going to make major changes to get better at what we do in early childhood state. So thanks everybody for having me in here for a few minutes. Keep up the good work. Honor and privilege to be 57.
I want to just add my thanks. Thank you, Governor Parson, for being here. Really appreciate your his leadership on these issues. So thank you very much. It's now my honor to introduce Representative Shields, who's going to kick off our panel. And Representative Shields.
Thank you all. Okay. That's not on. Is this on? Yeah, there we go. Thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited that you're taking time out of your day, especially on a technical session for the House, that you're sticking around and listening to this. I wanted to share with you why I'm involved in early learning. I can remember my aha moment like it was yesterday, but it was early in 2000, and I was attending a United Way conference, and there was a breakout session that said economic reasons for investing in early learning. And being a business person, I thought the economic reasons for investing in early learning seemed kind of interesting. It was being presented by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and I'm like, why would they even care about early learning? So I attended, and they started talking about the Perry Preschool Project, which you all could look up, but it was this long extended project or a research study that they did about having some children in early learning, and then they followed them for 27 years. So this was a very long study. But this gentleman from the Federal Reserve started talking about your rate of investment. And the rate of investment, if we would put money into early learning, how much we could save on the back end, in prisons, in welfare, and all those items that as a state eat up so much of our state budget. And so I went back to my community and I became heavily engaged in the early learning projects that we had going, and I brought business leaders across our community, and we created the Success by Six program in St. Joseph, Missouri. And I am so happy that you're here. I am passionate about early learning, yes, because of my mother, but more importantly, because it's the right thing to do for our state for a business reason. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next guest. I'm very excited that she's here. She spoke about her, Sarah Lytle. She's the Director of Outreach and Education at the Institute of Learning and Brain Science at the University of Washington. She's a graduate of Notre Dame and is a PhD in Development and Psychology from Temple University, where she studied the role of social cues in infants and toddler language learning from screen image. So with that, I'd like to welcome Sarah. I think she's up on the screen.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Representative Shields, for a wonderful introduction and for beautifully making the case for the economic return on investment for early learning, which I think is such an important part of this story. What I'd like to do, though, is back up a little bit and spend the next little while talking about the brain science that underlies the importance of early learning. So there's an economic case to be made, but I think there's also a brain science case to be made. And so that's what I'd like to spend some time doing here this morning. And we will certainly have some time for questions at the end. Okay. So let's see here. All right. So what I'd like to talk about this morning is what brain science says about why those early years in children's lives are so very important. As Representative Shields mentioned, I'm coming from the University of Washington in Seattle, and our Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences is a rather unique research institute in that we not only do research, but we also have an in-house outreach and education team, and that's the team that I direct. And our goal here is really to do cutting edge research that lets us know, why those early years are so very important. But then we have this team of science communicators whose job it is to share this information with people who can make a difference in the lives of children, such as yourselves. So we do a lot of work with policymakers to think about, how you can infuse the science of early learning and use that to really guide policy decisions that you're making. We do a lot of work with early learning providers to think about those daily interactions with children. And of course, we do a lot of work with parents as well. And all of this is really in service of creating a world in which children thrive. As Governor Parson said, we know that is such an important piece for, this long-term investment. And those early years are so very important. But let's step back for a moment and think about why we're really focused on those early years. What does brain science tell us about why this is an important time in children's lives? Well, on a very basic level, we know that when children are born, their brains are about 25% of what they will eventually be as adult size. That's enormous. If you think about your adult height or weight and divide it by 4, that would be a very big baby. And so babies' brains are already an incredible, they take up an incredible amount of that very tiny body. And if you zoom ahead 5 years and think about when children are entering kindergarten, we know that their brains are already about 92% of what they will eventually be as adult size. That's an incredible amount of growth in those early 5 years. Those first 5 years. Now, I will say that 92% size, of course, does not mean 92% done developing. We know that there's a lot of development that still needs to happen. I think anybody who's ever spent time with a 5-year-old can attest to that. 5-year-olds still have a lot to learn. But what it does tell us is that there's an enormous amount of brain growth that's happening in those early years. And we know that that's going to form the foundation for a lot of future learning that happens for children. So what is the work of that early childhood and the early brain growth? Well, we know that when children are born, they're born with almost all of the neurons that they'll ever have, almost all those brain cells that they'll ever have, about 86 billion of them. But the problem is there aren't any connections between those. You might think of it as if, children have all of the telephone poles that they need, but there's no wires that allow the communication to happen, that communication to pass back and forth between those neurons. So making those connections, building that network, that architecture of the brain is really the work of those first 5 years of life. Every time a child experiences something, every time they learn something new, they're building those important connections between neurons. So if you're going out and taking a walk around the neighborhood and you see a dog for the first time, you might talk about the dog. You might say the word dog. You might talk about the stick that the dog is carrying. All of those experiences the child has is really going to start forming those all important connections. If you think about it from a social emotional development standpoint, when a baby cries and a caregiver goes over and provides comfort to the baby, that child is learning that when I need something, there's going to be a responsive adult that helps me and that helps regulate my emotions in those early days before I'm able to do it for myself. So all of those experiences are really building that rich network of connections. We oftentimes like to think of it as building an ecosystem in a sense. And so if you think about that early brain as a very immature forest, you have all these saplings, the roots don't go very deep, the branches aren't very long, they don't really overlap between, from one tree to the next. It's a fairly immature forest. But over time, all of that development, all of those connections, you're building the most complex system known to man. And so you can think about that as being akin to this much more mature forest. So the roots of those trees are very, very deep. The trunks of the trees have grown very sturdy and stable. And the branches are long, they're reaching over and overlapping with the branches of nearby trees. This is becoming a dense and very rich, very complex ecosystem that children are building in those first 5 years. But importantly, it's not just all about growth. growth is an incredibly important part of those early years, but it's not the only thing. So children go through this period of blooming, and we like to think of the brain as going through this 3-part process in those early years. So part of the growth piece of it is really that blooming. That's where all of those connections are being made. Children are having new experiences, starting to build that very rich network. But then the next piece of things that happens is this pruning process. So over time, children's brains start to react to their environment and think about, what kinds of experiences do I have frequently? I'm going to build up those connections over time. What kinds of experiences do I seem to have less frequently? And, maybe not, I had an experience once, I never experienced it again. And so we're going to start to prune back those kinds of connections because they're noise in the brain to a certain extent, and they're just not needed. But the pruning piece is important because what it does is it allows that brain to thrive over time. So those remaining connections after the pruning process occurs, those remaining connections become much stronger, much more efficient, and it really allows the brain to thrive in a particular context. I think that sometimes we hear parents, quote the use it or lose it sentiment here. And, to a certain extent, I appreciate that that's a fear, but I think it's also really important to understand that pruning is a natural part of brain development. And in fact, it's an important part. We know that, when children are about 3 to 4 years of age, for example, they have about 2 to 3 times the number of connections in their brain as the adult brain. That's too much. It makes you not efficient. It's as if, if you were to run on that brain for the long term, you'd be just running over time, right? I mean, you're constantly multitasking. You're not able to do any one task very efficiently. And so by engaging in that pruning process, the brain really figures out which of those connections that I need as a child in my environment, and those are the connections that we're going to build out. Now, another piece of this that I think is important to understand is that those connections are built on experiences, and the brain doesn't distinguish between good experiences and bad experiences. The brain simply recognizes experiences. So if we go back to my example of a crying baby, for example, if a baby cries and, reliably there's a caregiver around who's able to come over and provide comfort to the baby, that's the experience that the child is going to learn to expect. That's the pattern that more often than not, when I cry, I expect that somebody's going to be there to help me regulate my emotions. Now, in contrast, if I'm a baby and I cry, and sometimes there's somebody who can come over and comfort, but oftentimes I'm left to my own devices to kind of figure it out. I don't have that reliable caregiver to provide comfort. That's the pattern that I'm going to get used to in my world, and that's the pattern that I'm going to form this brain architecture accordingly. And so when we're thinking about the kinds of experiences that we give children in those early years, it's important to understand that their brain is going to adapt and build and provide that foundation based on whatever kinds of experiences they have. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about those earliest experiences as being important. They're high quality early experiences, because we want every child, ideally, to form that brain architecture based on these high quality early experiences, because that's going to set them up for success later on. Now, if we go back to pruning and think about this 3-part brain development process, the blooming, pruning, and thriving, we know that this process happens at different times for different areas of the brain and for different skills in the brain. So, for example, we know that sensory skills are mostly formed first, most often. So things like your sense of vision, your sense of smell, those are and your sense of hearing, your auditory sense, those are going to be developed very early. They oftentimes develop starting prenatally. The peak in terms of number of connections happens at a very early age, and that's when the pruning happens. Now, next in development, you tend to have your language and motor that happens in those early years, in terms of when that pruning period happens and when your brain sort of solidifies that these are the connections that we're going to have. Now, I said solidified. I probably should not have said that, because we know that these are windows of opportunity when the brain learns best, but the window is never closed. So we've moved away from this sort of critical period kind of language and thinking more about those windows of opportunity as the prime time when something happens, but it's never the opportunity is never lost. And then lastly, we know that higher cognitive skills, things like planning, your ability to recognize consequences for your actions, those kinds of skills tend to develop at a later age. And in fact, we know that for some of those skills, children and young adults don't actually have them and don't actually have adult-like capabilities until about their mid-20s or so. So this period of brain development happens mostly in the first 5 years, but we know that brain development continues over time and even into early adulthood. And so as we start to think about how the brain develops these connections, we know that those experiences, like we talked about, are so very important. Every time you see a leaf, you go for a walk with a caregiver, you're forming connections. Maybe you got a new scooter recently for your birthday, and you're going to take that out for a spin. You're building those connections, and those connections are going to get stronger if you have those experiences repeatedly and over time. So it really is true that those earliest experiences build the foundational architecture of our brains. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a peek into how in the world we ever study this as researchers. And we are at iLabs very fortunate to have a machine called the MEG, or magnetoencephalography. You can see the machine here pictured on the left-hand side of the screen. It looks like an old-fashioned hair dryer that's got a dome that you put your head into. And you can see baby Emma here on the right-hand side. She's 6 months old, and she's sitting inside that domed head. And she's got a little koosh ball in her hand to keep her happy and active. And you can actually see that she's wearing a cap on her head. So as she is involved in a particular task, that cap has little GPS kind of pellets inside of it, and it allows us to track her head movement within the dome at all times. The dome contains 306 sensors, and so we are able to get incredible accuracy in terms of where and when activation is happening in the brain while kids are involved in a particular task. So baby Emma here is actually listening to sounds of language through insert earbuds that you can't really see in this picture. But we're interested in this particular study, and I think this is a good example of thinking about the importance of those early experiences. And so we're going to use language here as one experience that a child might have at an early age. And so baby Emma is listening to sounds of language like ra, la, ta, da through those insert earbuds. And what we want to do is we want to start to see and look at how the different language areas of the brain start to connect and communicate with one another. And so we're looking here at both the language production or speaking area of the brain and the language perception or hearing and listening area of the brain. And so we're looking at the coordination and how those two regions really start to talk together. We brought in kids at 3 different ages. So we brought in newborns. And when we looked at newborn brains as they're listening to those sounds of language, we saw some activation in the language perception or hearing area of the brain, and not a lot of activation in the language production or speaking area of the brain. To be honest, that's pretty much what we expected. These are newborns. They haven't had a lot of experience hearing language yet. And it's good that we know they're hearing the language. So that's pretty much what we expected. I'm going to zoom ahead here to what we saw with the 12-month-olds. And then we'll fill in the 6-month-old results here. But with 12-month-olds, when the 12-month-olds are listening to sounds of language, you see some activation in the language perception, the hearing area of the brain, and you see some activation in language production or speaking area of the brain. And you can see that coordination pictured on that, the third image to the right there. Now that's important, but again, not terribly surprising. Anybody who's been around a 12-month-old lately knows that at 12 months of age, children are on the cusp of their first words if they've not already said their first words. They've definitely been babbling for a couple of months already. So they're really starting to make sounds of language themselves. So it's not terribly surprising to us that we see that activation in the speaking area of the brain, because that's really where they are developmentally. So that's good. What was really interesting to us, though, is what we see with the 6-month-old brain. So if you look at the 6-month-old brain, and as 6-month-olds are listening to those sounds of language, you start to see activation in both the listening and speaking area of the brain. Now, why is that notable? And some coordination between those two areas. Why is that notable? It's notable because at 6 months of age, children are not yet saying their first words. They really aren't babbling yet. Babbling doesn't really come online until about 8 or 9 months of age. And yet, even though they've not gotten to that linguistic, productivity point themselves, a 6-month-old is still showing us activation in that language production area of the brain. We think of this as indicative of almost like a rehearsal kind of mechanism that's happening. So as a 6-month-old is sitting there, they're taking in those sounds of language and starting to think, if I were to jump into this conversation, how would I need to produce those sounds? What would I want to say? It's this important kind of rehearsal activation that's going to allow the really rich connectivity and communication between those two language areas later on when children are actually starting to speak in words and sentences and paragraphs. But I think from a why should we care about this sort of standpoint? I think this is really important because at 6 months of age, us as adults, we see no evidence that children are using language yet. They're really just listening to us. And so they're bathed in all of the language of their environment, but they're really not giving us any indication that it's making a difference yet. And yet, when we have this MEG technology, when we're able to take a peek under the hood, you start to see how much is happening in terms of children's brain development before we ever see any behavioral evidence of it. And I think that's critical because what it means is that before children are ever saying, giving us an indication that what we're doing matters, their brain development is absolutely dependent on the environment that they're in. And so you can imagine that as a child, a 6-month-old who's taking in all the sounds that they hear, they really need to be in a language-rich environment in order for their brain to start building those connections that will eventually, show up to us in the form of words and sentences and paragraphs. And so for anybody who says, I'll start talking to my child when they talk back, luckily we don't hear that too much anymore. But if you ever hear that, you're missing an opportunity here, a really important opportunity to help that child build those incredible connections in their brain that are going to be so very important later on. It's that foundational architecture that we really need to pay attention to in those early years. So again, I take this study as really important evidence that those early experiences matter. And I'll give you just one additional study that we have done also on language development, but again, with this sort of take-home message of those early experiences matter. So here we're looking at different language environments that children have as a way to look at the kinds of experiences that children have with language early on. So we're comparing here monolingual English speakers to bilingual Spanish English speakers. And what we see is that even by 11 months of age, children have specialized, their brain is already specialized to hear the sounds of language in the language or languages that they are exposed to. So if you look at this graph here, you'll see that the monolinguals in red here on this red line, at 11 months of age, they've already sort of pruned away the ability to hear sounds that only exist in Spanish, but they've gotten really good at hearing the sounds that exist in English. That's perfect because that for them is in accordance with their experiences. If you live in an English speaking environment, it makes sense that your brain is going to specialize to hear those sounds in language, the English sounds of language. In contrast, the bilinguals with the blue line here, you see that by 11 months of age, those bilinguals have equally good perception of Spanish sounds and English language sounds. That's important because that's their environment. And so your brain really is starting to specialize even before your first birthday. Your brain is specializing to make it the perfect brain for the environment that you're living in. So again, I would say that those earliest experiences really do build that foundational architecture of our brains. And as we start to think about the kinds of things that impact children's brain development in those early years, I think Allison, when she gave you the how and why and what image of in the tour of early learning, I think that's a great way to look at it. I like to think about this graph that has been developed by UNICEF, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. And they talk about 5 different components of nurturing care. And those 5 components, they say, are good health, adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, and opportunities for early learning. And so I want to think just, in terms of our research and the work that we do, we really start to think about these 2 pieces here, those opportunities for early learning and responsive caregiving. So I want to spend just a few minutes unpacking what goes into that and what those kinds of things are. Now, I think at a very core level, we know that that connection is key. Children learn from social experiences, and that has been shown time and time again. If you plop a child in front of a television screen, they're not going to learn nearly as much if you give them the same content from a live human being. They look up to other people. We have lots of studies of imitation, that kids are going to imitate the adults and the caregivers around them, and older siblings too. I'm sure people have stories of children, imitating for better or for worse. But that's one of those powerful social mechanisms of learning. And so that social piece is really key. And when you think about that responsive caregiving, that means that, when a child asks you a question, you're going to give them that response. It's that back and forth turn taking that is so very important. It's responding to your child's bids for attention. It doesn't have to be perfect every time, but it needs to be more reliable than not, right? And so through these early interactions, you start to pick out a lot of components that are ultimately going to be very important for children's later learning. I mentioned imitation. That social piece is key, but why is it key? Well, we know that children learn a lot from the eye gaze of adults. They're able to sort of follow your eye gaze around a room and figure out what it is you're talking about. We know that, children love to ask questions, and the more that adults can learn alongside children and be a partner in their learning with them, as opposed to the adult who has all the answers, we know that that's going to really foster children's sense of curiosity and exploration, all of those kind of really good things that are going to lead to success later on. And so as you're starting to think about those kinds of interactions, whether they are adult-child interactions or whether they are these interactions between peers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm listening. I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to stick around. I can't.
So maybe just a reminder, if you could remember to mute yourself, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And so as we're starting to think about some of these early interactions, you see this lovely image here, I think, of children with blocks. And you can imagine the kinds of things that are happening here. So, the children are talking about stacking blocks, maybe one on top of the other. They might be taking turns. Maybe the girl in the middle is going to put that one block on top, and then the girl on the left might, it might be her turn to add that next block. As you're thinking about all those kinds of interactions, and perhaps there's an adult nearby who's, asking questions about, how can we make this a little bit taller, or, is it, what are you representing? Is it a house? Is it a tower? Is it a giraffe? Starting to be creative and think about those imagination skills. We know that all of that is going to build the skills that we think of as next generation skills. So we're starting to get away from this idea of, children being prepared for kindergarten by the time that they know their ABCs and colors and numbers. We want to move away from that a little bit to think about some of those deeper skills that kids need. And, this is by far not a complete list, but I would suggest to you that it's important over time that children, learn to take turns and seek help, that they develop the ability to solve problems, that they can both lead and follow and play. So we want them to have this playful learning experience. Again, tons and tons of research suggests that the more children have that playful learning experience, the better their outcomes, the better their learning outcomes. Self-regulation is key. What does self-regulation mean? It means your ability to regulate your own emotions, and this idea that you're going to control your own emotions. Everybody gets angry or agitated at some point. How do you calm yourself down? How do you go back and regulate yourself? As an infant and probably early toddler, you oftentimes have an adult or caregiver to help you regulate. And how do you develop those regulation strategies on your own? Are you going to put yourself in timeout for a few minutes to calm down? Or are you going to take 5 deep breaths? That's an incredibly important ability, a lifelong skill, really, that children can start to develop in these early years. We know that controlling impulses is going to be very important. That allows children to develop friendships and keep friendships, right? Every time you want to shout out an answer in class, we know that that's not necessarily the right way to go about it. So you need to control those impulses. We want kids who can explore the environment. Exploration is so key. You learn so much. And there's, again, a lot of research suggesting that the more kids explore and learn things for themselves and start to ask questions, it really fosters a sense of curiosity that will serve children well for the long term. Routines are incredibly important for children. It gives them predictability. It allows them to have some boundaries that they know that they can operate within. So that's an important skill for that next generation. A child who's aware of their own emotions, learning emotions that, of course, help self-regulation abilities. But, how do you feel? And why are you feeling that way? And it also helps you connect to other people. If you feel sad, well, this is what I feel like when I feel sad, or this is something that makes me sad. And shifting attention well. So being able to go from one task to another, and maybe it's going from something that's really fun, like outdoor play, to coming in and taking a nap. That ability to switch between different tasks, particularly if you're switching to something that's not as exciting or not as much fun, is an important ability for children to develop. And so we start to think of these things as really building that child who's ready to enter kindergarten in the K-12 system. And of course, these abilities are going to have to be fully in place by then. Something like self-regulation is one of those higher order cognitive skills that still is developing in your, into your mid-20s. So these are, of course, not going to be fully developed, but these are the kinds of things that you can really start to develop in those first 5 years through those high quality early experiences. Now, as much as I think that, we oftentimes, or at least I often default to thinking about, okay, what does high quality childcare look like? And I think that's incredibly important and a good question for us to be asking. And we know that high quality care environments for children are very important and yield great returns over the long haul. But I think it's also important to remember and consider that when you think about where children are in those early years, they spend a lot of their time in these informal learning environments. So formal learning environments are places like childcare, preschool. When you get to that K-12 system, certainly that's going to take up more of children's time. But those informal learning environments form what we like to casually call the sea of blue, because it's so massive in terms of the amount of time that children spend there. And so I think it's important for us to remember that these informal learning environments can be places like, at home, maybe it's the library, or, it's those environments that children are in every day, the playground. But oftentimes they are supervised and led by caregivers and parents. And so I think it's important for us to remember that parents are, in fact, children's first and best teachers. And so if we're thinking about the conditions in which children thrive and their brain development, builds that strongest foundation possible, we know that children thrive on a very basic level when their basic needs are met and when they're in the context of relationships with caring and responsive adults. Now, if we think about when parents are best able to support children, we know that parents are best able to support children when their own basic needs are met, they have time to engage with their child, and their stress level is low or manageable. And so I oftentimes think that, for policymakers, one way to think about supporting children is to think about supporting the family unit. And if you're supporting the family unit, you might consider, yes, we want to think about children's needs and what we can provide directly for kids. But I think it's important to also consider what we can provide for parents that it's going to allow them to be their best parent to be the best parent to their child. And so if you start to think about these kinds of the kinds of policies that might impact that, and certainly I'll be talking about that later today in other sessions of the symposium. But you'll start to think, in my opinion, I think you'll think about some different and new things and maybe some unusual suspects in addition to usual suspects. So just to throw out there, an incomplete but starter list, for example, you might think about family policies. How do parents have the opportunity to form those initial bonds with children and be available for their children in the early years of life, and if children are sick and need care. High quality childcare, of course, that's one of those usual suspects, but should always make the list. And do we have available childcare slots? So not only is it high quality, but is it available to parents and families? We want to think about affordable housing, and affordable housing that is also safe, right? And so if parents are less concerned and less stressed about their home environment, they're going to be able to be a better parent to their child. We want to think about, again, giving parents a living wage. So if a parent, again, is not stressed about money or where that next meal is going to come from, they can spend more time being that high quality parent to their child. Thinking about access to services, including but not limited to medical care, but also community services like libraries. Can parents access some of those resources that are going to be very helpful in their parenting journey, in their family journey. Transportation, this is going to look different in every community. I live in Seattle, and so buses are a big mode of transportation for us here. And so, from my perspective, can I take one bus that gets me to my child's childcare location, or do I have to take 3 buses? And do they run on time, and are they affordable? And we also want to be thinking about things like access to information in preferred language, in the parent's preferred language. So just making sure that the information that we are providing to parents is in fact accessible to them. So again, I think that this is just a starter list of some things that you might consider, but I hope that you'll consider supporting children with policies that are, directly directed to them, but also thinking about supporting that family unit. Because again, we know that parents are children's first and best teachers, and that really is going to allow, a parent to be the best parent that they can be. So I want to make sure we have time for questions, but I will leave this up. This will get you to our website that we have on the iLab site here, and our outreach team has put together a number of resources, including a few policy briefs, infographics, one-pagers, things of that nature, all free and available on our website. So I would encourage you to check those out for more information. And if you're interested in joining our newsletter, we send out quarterly newsletters. You should feel free to join that, or you can always email me and let me know. So I think with that, I'll leave this slide up just so you have plenty of time to get those web addresses, and would love to answer some questions.
Do you want to ask? Yeah.
I have a question about where Sarah's maybe seen good examples of things she's.
Does she need to move? Can you hear her?
I think
Maybe
I wonder, to reiterate the questions after they come out. Rep. Shields, can you do that?
Okay, so will you start over?
I'm just curious if she has examples of places that are doing those things well.
Examples of places where they're doing these things well.
It's a great question. I think there are a lot of examples across the country of places that are doing different aspects of this well and doing pieces of this well. I think, depending on exactly what you're looking for, I think that we, that there are certainly programs that exist, and you heard about Perry Preschool Project a little bit earlier, I think, from Representative Shields. And I think that the EduCare program is certainly one place that I would cite as a program that is doing. They provide wraparound services to the family. They provide high quality early learning services to children. There's a lot of really good work that's going on there. We do a lot of work with the Office of Head Start at the federal level, and there are certainly Head Start programs across the country that are certain great examples of folks that are doing these kinds of things well. So I think that the list of people who are doing it well is extensive. I think the list that is a little bit shorter is places that have figured out how to do this kind of work at scale. And so I think that tends to be the more elusive example of these kinds of things at scale. And for a number of reasons. I think that the Perry Preschool Project is a famous example of really high quality early care. It was also incredibly expensive per child, and so I think one of the things that folks at large are thinking about is how you really provide that high quality, which is possible at a large scale, in a lot of, and trying to figure out what are the kinds of things that really impact that and drive the quality of those early learning programs. So that's all of that is to say, yes, there are great examples out there of folks that are doing this well. I think that to do it at a sort of, at more of the systemic level, I think is the piece that I think is a touch more elusive.
I have a question to Sarah about brain development, particularly, have there been studies done as far as firstborns in compared to successive children? Because as a firstborn, and I noticed it with my firstborn, he may have had, or I may have had, more access to some of the things that you have up there, whereas the siblings are developing by copying the firstborn. Have your studies borne that out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's been some research on that. We've not done any research at iLabs on that, but there certainly is some work that's been done on that. I think that there are pros and cons to both, right? I mean, I think that as firstborns, you tend to have a higher percentage of one-on-one time with parents and caregivers, which we know is an important factor for things that particularly like language development. There is some anecdotal evidence that second-borns and subsequent borns, I should say, tend to speak a little bit later. Part of that seems to be because older siblings will talk for them, so they don't need language as soon because the older sibling can interpret what they want and make that request to parent or caregiver. But then again, you're right in the sense that younger siblings tend to have more access to that peer support, certainly than firstborns did. And we know that that's also a big driver of learning. So all of this is to say pros and cons both ways. There is some research on it, but it does developmentally, it all seems to kind of even out in the wash, as it were. So over time, there's really no systemic differences in firstborns and subsequent borns.
Dave.
Those on one of your slides there, you talk about income levels. What can be done as far as success in setting families up that are not in the same demographic, want to provide their children the same opportunities throughout the entire state? What can we do as legislators and policymakers to be able to ensure we can set them up for success?
Yes. So I think income has, you can think about it from a number of different perspectives. And so I think when, as I used it in this presentation, I was thinking of it as, when you think about income levels and income being a stress factor for parents. And that's sort of how I was conceptualizing it here. But we also know that it impacts other pieces in other areas. So we know that if you are living in a lower income household, your parents tend to have fewer books, fewer of those, learning kinds of enrichments for children. And so I think, but I will say that there's also some work and some research suggesting that, the more you can make sure that families, particularly families who are, low socioeconomic status families, low income families, have access to community resources, whether or not they use them, which I think is a really interesting piece of thing. But if they have access to community resources and know that there are resources that they could access if they wanted to, that actually seems to improve the quality of their parenting and lower their stress level. So I would say from a policy perspective, you can think about things like, making sure that families are being paid, a living wage. You can think about things like making sure families have access, you can think about policies that support the existence of community resources like libraries, like food banks, like, all those kinds of things that we know support low income families. And then I would say, make sure that families know about it and, make it easy for them to access them. And then this research really does suggest that whether or not families access them, simply knowing that they're there is going to make them a better parent, which I think is really interesting. So it's, I think, more of this, kind of creating that community. We are a community that supports you and your family. And so I would, think of that framing as you consider policies that might support low-income families in particular.
And when you talked about stress and about childcare, I can remember, and I think this transcends across all economic levels, the most stressful time of my life is when I was having to find childcare for my children and knowing that it was there every day. And even when that wasn't happening, that was probably the most stressful part for me for having a child. Any other questions?
If I could actually riff on that for just a minute, Representative Shields, I think you're absolutely right. And we know that particularly in that first year of life, parent stress levels are incredibly high. And so, if we think about ways that we can mitigate that, home visiting programs have been shown to be incredibly effective. And it's less, part of that is certainly parent education, but part of it is also community building. And, you're not in it alone, and, getting parents out of that sort of isolated feeling that can sometimes exist, particularly in those very, very early years. And so if you think about, ways that you can kind of create that community around a parent, particularly a first-time parent, and particularly in that first year of life, we know the child outcomes are going to improve as a result.
And I don't know how many of you know, but we have counties in our state that are childcare deserts in our state. They don't have a single licensed childcare facility in their state. I do have one question, and I'll go back to the audience, but what do you think the effects of COVID have been on early childhood development?
That is the $1 million question these days. I think that there are. I think it's certainly been a challenging time for everybody, for parents and kids alike. As much as we think about, kids learning from those, highly social experiences, we know that oftentimes children's, social world has been limited to whoever is living in their household, whereas before they might have had much more exposure to to peers and to other adults and other caregivers in different settings. And so it's been hard for sure. And and I think there's more and more research coming out about parent stress levels during COVID, and that certainly is going to affect children's development. That said, we also know that children are incredibly resilient, and children will learn in whatever environment they're in. And so I think that the more we can, as parents, take care of ourselves and try to, exercise self-care and, and give ourselves permission to do what we need to do in this incredibly stressful time, child outcomes are going to be better because of that. But, I also think you can be creative about it. Perhaps you're going to use video chat technology to really, touch base with family and friends that you can't see in person right now. And that we know that still gives children that social experience. Maybe you're going to plan an adventure day in your backyard if you have a backyard, and you're going to, maybe it's, it's going to be the mini Olympics of 2021, or, whatever that looks like. I think that there are still ways that you can give yourself something to look forward to, something to plan in this incredibly stressful time for everybody. But I think, part of it too is I think parents just remembering to take care of yourself and give yourself permission to be the best parent you can within these incredibly challenging circumstances. So I think more than that, I think that we are going to see how this works at the end. The more we can give children those educational and high quality experiences, even though they're going to look different than they did before, I think that that's going to certainly help buffer the effects of this strange time on children's development.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Craig, is it okay we move on before time?
I do have one question though.
Okay.
And then if somebody else has to move forward. My question is around books and enrichment. And I think it's fascinating that just families knowing that community resources exist is actually helps change behavior. Does that same thing play out for like having books in the home? So obviously as a young parent myself, we're always encouraged to read to your child 15 minutes a day, but is there research to show that actually having the books in the home does a similar type thing, just encouraging the exploring?
It's a great question, but I think the answer is no. So kids do actually benefit from that time together spent reading and spent sharing a book. It's also, I would say it's also and separately important to have books in the home that are appropriate for your child, particularly as they get older, that, it can be a routine and something that they ask for and request. And so from that perspective, it's important to have books in the home, but it is actually, important to think about that time together. And if you think about why that is, when you share books with a child, particularly a young child, oftentimes there's, physical closeness. They might be sitting on your lap or sitting right next to you. So it's this time that you're sharing together. You typically are, really invested in the moment and engaged in the moment. So you tend to not have distractors like, phone or TV or things like that. But it really starts to get children used to books. And, some parents, I think, ask, is it okay if children are chewing books? And in fact, yes, it is, because that's an important part of learning to read. They're getting used to books and what they taste like, for young children is part of that exploration process. But as they get older, they learn the conventions of book reading. So, what it feels like to turn a page. And I, to a certain extent, yes, it's great to read books. I think it gets us out of our vocabulary rut that we sometimes get in as adults, and it gives children exposure to new and different words and concepts, which is really important. But it's also great to just read the book without reading the book, and so go through and look at the pictures. Use the book as a scavenger hunt one day. And repeat books over time too. Children love repetition, but it also helps them learn. So I would say that the same is not necessarily true for that. I tend to think that what's going on when parents know about a community resource, whether or not they access it, to me, that says more about parents knowing that there's that sort of safety net in that community. And, if I really get to that point, I have access to that. Whereas I think that, and so for me, that's more of a buffer on parents' stress than anything else. Whereas the act of reading books is really an incredible learning experience for children. So yes, I think, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends reading from birth with kids, and certainly on, in those first, 7 to 10 to 14 days, that may be a tricky thing to do. And so, don't stress yourself out about it, but it is in fact an incredible learning experience for children.
Thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for this session. It has been wonderful, and I would like to right now introduce Senator Williams. He's going to come up and share a few thoughts with us. I guess we give a round of applause.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Sarah virtually for putting this together, as well as NCSL and various other groups, and all of you for participating today. As we know, this is an important issue that we need to focus on. And as a state senator, I think it's extremely important to be a priority for mine. Before I go any further, someone who understands this issue as well is our former colleague in the Senate, Senator Wayne Wallingford. It's really good to see you. If you guys research him a little bit, you'll find out he has a really amazing story and things that he's experienced in his life. So definitely good to see you. Recent data released that Missouri's secondary and elementary education revealed more than half of Missouri third graders could not read. COVID-19 impact on in-home and social distance learning has only made these numbers worse. So we know that sooner a child can learn to read, a child can read to learn. So increasing access to early childhood education is extremely important. It'll help make our kids be ready to learn on day one. We all understand how important that first day really sets a student up for the rest of their lives. Making it more affordable for every family, increasing numbers of providers in every community. And I think it's really important to understand that we must put real dollars behind this effort. And that'll be something I'll be focused on in the Senate, as well as ensuring that we not only fund early childhood education, but we understand how it really has a significant impact on how our children learn. But it's also really important to recognize that this is an issue that's extremely important, but it also has bipartisan support. And those are the issues that we really need to make sure we champion, because this issue is not about us, it's about our children. So I want to thank you all again for the opportunity not only to speak, but recognize how important this issue is to champion. And I'm looking forward to all of us working together, not only to get it across the finish line in Missouri, but to also set an example for the rest of the country. Thank you all so much. God bless you all. And it's really a tremendous honor to be a part of this program.
Thank you, Senator Wood. Next up, we have the economic and business case for investing in early childhood. And we're going to be joined by two panelists here, and we have a third, I believe, virtually. So go ahead and assemble up front. And please join me in welcoming our subject matter experts, Carolyn Chrisman, Dr. Carolyn Chrisman, Tyler Notberg, and Linda Rollo. In the interest of time, full biographical sketches are available online, so we'll do the brief. Dr. Chrisman is in her 9th year serving as Executive Director of Kirksville Regional Economic Development, Inc., better known as K-READY. In her prior life, Carolyn taught middle school social studies and was elected to Kirksville City Council at the age of 26, which is where her interest in economic development began. And Carolyn is also the mother of 4 children under the age of 6. Round of applause there. Tyler Notberg is 5th generation leading U.S. engineering, where he's the vice president. He is the founder of Aligned, a group of business leaders focused on improving education in Kansas and Missouri. He's also worked as a policy analyst at the Eisenhower Institute and for Senator Richard Lugar. He's a trustee of Colorado Succeeds and serves on the Systems Advancement Board of the University of Kansas Health System. Our final panelist, Linda Rollo, is Vice President of Aligned, where she oversees education policy and legislation in Missouri. Linda advocates for public policy that supports education solutions from birth to work, focusing on early childhood and workforce development policies. In a previous life, Linda served as a legislative assistant in the Missouri House of Representatives, so welcome back. Thank you folks for educating us today. My aha moment goes back to 1973 when my mother founded St. John's Lutheran Pre-Kindergarten Program, which she ran for 20 years. And I remember a couple of things about that, having grown up around it, how much she bragged on those kids every day, how smart they were, how much they learned. And I also remember her saying something really unusual, that the most powerful force in the world is the imagination of a child, because they know no limits until we tell them no, and we correct them and all that kind of good stuff. When you think about that, those of us who've had parents, who've had the kids that have those imaginations, I think there's some truth in that. So what we want to do with this particular session is to highlight important conversations around economic and business cases for investments in early childhood. Topic is tied to today's workforce because many parents, as we know, we've talked about already, need childcare to work. We do have all sorts of deserts. I have one in my district. We also have the need to train up highly qualified workforce tomorrow, considering the impact of the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and some of the scary statistics about how many jobs that exist today will not exist when our children entering kindergarten will graduate from high school. So we'll go ahead and start off with questions, and let's hear from each one of you. Please explain to the group here, first of all, who you are, what you do related to early childhood, and if you could highlight the realization that childcare drives both the workforce of today and tomorrow. And last, and certainly not least, what brought you to this work or keeps you engaged in this particular area? So we'll start off with Carol.
Okay, that seems like a lot. Hopefully you all can hear me. So back to, my day job is that I am, in short respects, economic developer in Kirksville, Missouri. And so, I work with my local companies and businesses on issues that they have. How do they stay in my community? How do they employ people at a living wage? How do they do all of those things? And so when there are issues, they come to me. And over a year ago, they came to me and said, we've got a problem. We have employees who can't find childcare. And, we're a food processor. That's what we do. We don't know how to provide childcare. And so when I had a number of businesses come to me, it's like, okay, this is a community problem. This is a business problem. It becomes my problem. And so that is how I kind of came to be involved. We have a community committee that got set up to study the issue in our area. I have survey data from that because we did do a survey with over 600 local employees taking that survey, and I've got data from that. And then we started on how as a community are we going to respond, and we kind of have like a 3-prong approach. We've come to understand it's a very complex issue, but it's one that we want to solve. And then personally, I've been involved as Representative Riggs told you in early childhood, simply because I have 4 small children that now, they just had birthdays in like November, December. And so I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And so, I am also personally involved in that, and I want to see all kids have exactly what they need to survive and grow. And so, I know from the short term today how childcare can affect the workforce, and then I've seen it in my home how childcare and early learning is going to affect the future workforce. So that's how I came to be involved. That's why I'm involved and care passionately about finding solutions, moving upstream in order to solve the problems for people of all socioeconomic, leveling the playing field for all. And so I guess I will kind of leave it there, Representative, and let others answer.
Okay, thank you. Tyler, we'll make sure you're unmuted. Same question. How did you get involved with this? What do you see? And what are the types of things we're looking at here to help drive the workforce of today and tomorrow?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Now I'm super big. Well, I decided to get into the issue of early childhood education many years ago when I was still working for an organization called Gerson Lehrman Group. And I had started looking at the science behind brain development through a variety of different friends. I'm now chairman and CEO of U.S. Engineering Company, and we are a mechanical construction firm. We install plumbing, piping, HVAC systems commercially all over the United States. We have a number of different companies that do that. And when I started there about 16 years ago, from the very beginning, it was quite clear that I always needed to be thinking about the workforce of tomorrow. So my experience on the policy side of things, combined with a lot of really smart people teaching me about the science behind sort of brain development, I sort of put one and one and one together and decided this is an issue that I'm really passionate about. Like many of you, then all of a sudden I had children who I very early on found out that I couldn't control all of their actions. I could only control the environment that they were in up to a certain extent. And there were a lot of other very smart individuals who were engaged in the policy framework surrounding early childhood education that began to talk with me about ways that we could have an impact long-term on that quality, as well as the access to those types of facilities, teachers, and experiences that would really turn into an economic development issue as opposed to simply a moral issue around, hey, kids should be educated. So from my standpoint, early on, there was this sort of great confluence of economic development and good for the community. But at U.S. Engineering, it was about thinking about what the workforce of tomorrow might look like. So one of the things that I did, in addition to becoming a trustee of Colorado Succeeds, was to rip off a little bit of that business model and say, okay, if businesses are going to need to be prepared for the future, and businesses are getting their team members from the school system, and we know that there are a lot of issues with the way the school systems are set up and what some of the flaws are, is it okay for the business communities to simply sit back and say, hey, we're going to be highly critical of what that system is producing, but you know what, I don't really want to engage in that. And I didn't think that was right. And so I began working with a small group of business leaders to say, I really think we need to be focused and engaged on education as a partner. And that's why I helped co-found Aligned, who Linda is with now, along with Tori Peterson and a few other individuals, so that we could really get a focus for the business community on early childhood education as an issue that would receive sustained attention. As a lot of you know, there are many different business organizations and other organizations around the state of Missouri that have subcommittees that are focused on education, which I think is great. We're the only statewide organization of business leaders that's a membership organization that's focused exclusively on that issue. And so to me, that has been one of the things that's continued to drive me to engage and meet with people, whether it's parents, whether it's educators, whether it's offering programs through U.S. Engineering that allow real-world learning experiences for 7th graders, 8th graders, internships, externships. All of those things stem back to what the early investments are that we can make as an organization, as a community, and that's an early childhood education. That's the greatest ROI that we can get. And it's the primary reason why I don't feel like I'm ever going to move away from this.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this event. This is so exciting. And thanks for Tyler's great comments. I'm really honored to be able to work for the organization that Tyler founded and to be able to fulfill the mission that he had, the vision he had for the state. Real simply, my aha moment happened in 2006. I was working with an inner city ministry in St. Louis, and we were working with high school students at Beaumont, which I think is since closed. And my husband and I took this group of kids out for lunch, really sweet kids. And we were at like Red Robin and we were ordering. And one of the boys was kind of had his head down, and the other boy next to him was whispering, "This is a hamburger. This is a cheeseburger. This is a chicken sandwich." And I just kind of held back. I didn't say anything. And I realized this boy, who's a senior in high school, could not read a menu. And it broke my heart into pieces. And I guess 6 months later, I asked about what happened to that boy to his minister. He said, "Oh, he graduated." And I'm thinking, great, he graduated from high school. He couldn't read a menu. And then I was at an event, and Governor Jay Nixon was running for governor. And so me not knowing anything about politics, just being obnoxious, I ran up to him and I told him this story. And I'm like, "What are you going to do about this?" And he said, "There's nothing we can do with this kid." I go, "What's going to happen to him?" He said, "He's probably going to come across my desk in some way of being incarcerated." And I said, "Well, what's the solution?" And he said, "Early childhood education." And that moment, it all went off, and I thought about my own children and their incredible experience having really high quality early childhood. And it's just been ever since then kind of a goal, a mission to keep figuring out how we can make these high quality experiences happen for every kid in the state, no matter where you live, no matter your economic situation. And it's not even always like just for poverty kids. I mean, we worked on a statewide initiative, and you could have a high income family and still not be getting those connections made. So it is a solution that can benefit every person. And so that was my aha moment. That's what drives me today. And I really feel like we've been making great progress thanks to really the work of the legislature and for the representatives and senators that understand the brain science and understand how we can move the needle. And I just can't tell you how excited I am right now. I don't think we've been in a better place than we ever have at this moment to kind of take it to a whole new level.
Thank you. Next question. How has your work as it relates to early childhood changed the past 5 years? And what do you predict or would you like to see happen in the next 3 to 5 years? Carolyn.
Well, I haven't been doing this work yet for 5 years as it regards early childhood, but I have seen over time, and especially with legislation over the past few years that really went out and hurt in-home daycares in our state. You know, we have seen the availability of licensed in-home daycares facilities just bottom out in our rural areas, to the case where we have daycare deserts. I mean, just to the count, I'm in Kirksville, Missouri, 17,500 people. County has about 26,000 people. To the county to the east of us, Knox County, they have no licensed facility at all. And so just some of the things that, you know, over the past few years, we've seen that take place. And so, you know, in the next few years, as I've said, there's you know, I think there are multiple issues with this, from not only the availability, the affordability, but then also we have, as every industry right now has a worker shortage, the childcare industry is no different. I mean, the centers I have now in my community they cannot find the workforce they need to provide the care. So, I mean, there are multiple fronts that need to be moved on. And so I don't know what the future holds or where I would like to see it not to be a problem anymore. So I guess that's all I have for you.
Thank you, Tyler.
You know, in terms of the way the work has changed, I would say that when I think about a lot of the ways in which my company is engaging with people, it's talking about what some of those soft skills really need to be in order for those individuals to thrive in our organization and the workforce in general. So I find myself having a lot more conversations about social emotional skills, the ability to problem solve, the ability to work in teams, and some of those basic skills that, or at least seem basic to me, but have always been core to some of those elements of high quality early childhood education. And so I've personally seen more discussions around, okay, well, how do we invest in those skills earlier? Not in opposition to all of the great work that's being done on the STEM side of things, which I think is extremely relevant. But I would say a lot of those conversations have shifted towards some of the soft skill development and why it needs to take place well before anyone ever enters into the workplace. And that's as true with teachers as it is with legislators who I've spoken with, and certainly other business individuals.
I will say from an advocacy perspective, when I first started working on early childhood issues in the legislature, I spent a lot of my time making the case, like explaining that early childhood investment really pays off and really selling the concept. And I don't have to sell the concept so hard anymore. I think there's a lot more support for the investment in early childhood. I think the struggle we face now is just figuring out how we're going to pay for it and how we're going to do it correctly. But I really see the fact that the whole idea of early childhood has kind of gone from babysitting. You don't hear people say babysitting anymore. Then they were saying childcare, and now it's really about early care and education. And with that earlier presentation on the brain science, when you think about what's happening with the baby's brain at that first year, I mean, it's about education. And so that's the part that it's exciting to see how we're learning so much more about what goes on in our brains that we don't have to work so hard to explain why the investment is important.
Thank you. Next question. What levels of engagement are you seeing within the business community, number one? And what levels of engagement would you like to see from the business community? Carol.
You know, over the last year, 18 months, 2 years, you know, the businesses in my community have taken a much more active role. And it's because it is directly affecting their workforce and their lack of a workforce. You know, as I told you that we did a survey locally in Kirksville, and we had 30, and those over 600 people took our survey over a course of 2 or 3 days, and they represented 35 businesses in my community. And they, you know, we documented from that at least 40% of those who took the survey said childcare had prevented employment for them in the past. 80% of the people who took our survey were women. You know, and so we know that this hits women harder. And so from our survey, which again, it was open 2 or 3 days, we needed just a quick snapshot in order to do things. We had over 170 people who currently needed childcare for, you know, 265 kids. If you look at Missouri Child Care Aware, you know, getting the numbers from them, there's a gap in my community of licensed spots versus the number of kids from from working parent households. There's a gap of 478 spots in my community alone. Okay, and I'm in a rural area. I mean, why did I have 4 kids? I'm doing my best to help our population. But there's a gap. And so the employers, they're saying we need to engage because we won't have workers because of it. And so they're coming to us saying, well, we can't open up a facility, but we're willing to help. What can we do? You know, basically, like, tell us what to do. And so, you know, in my community, we were really looking at a model of if we helped open something, then how can businesses participate? How can they reserve spots? Meaning, we pay so much a month and we reserve a spot for our employees, or we pay so much a month as sponsors, or they're ready to engage. And what we had kind of put together is fallen apart because you can't make it cash flow. I mean, I run our small business. I'm the center director for our small business development center. Can't make it cash flow. When you go with the numbers, and we were trying to plug the gap, and the biggest gap in our community is ages 0 to 3. You can't cash flow that. We were losing $25,000 a month in the business plan and the projections. Like, we're trying, and so we kind of had to hit pause on what we were trying to do and tell businesses, hey, we're looking at it, but businesses are business people. They're not going to help cash flow something that can't cash flow. They've got their what they can and cannot do. So we're still looking at it, but we are. Businesses are ready to be engaged. At least in my community, they're like, tell us what to do and we'll do it. We'll help. We just haven't connected all those dots ourselves yet.
Tyler?
So I would say that we've certainly seen, or I personally have seen, a whole lot more interest in people wanting to be involved in the work that Aligned is doing across the state of Missouri. I think some of that shows up with how robust our advisory board now is in St. Louis. I think it's one of those rare issues that communities like Columbia, Kansas City, and St. Louis can work on together, so that we're not isolating one another with Royals versus Cardinals or any of these other economic development efforts. And I also think that business leaders, to what Carol was saying, they need to be seen as being engaged in this issue because it's in our long-term interests. So, one of the things that's extremely important from an employer of choice standpoint is trying to figure basic things out, like what's your maternity and paternity policy look like, but also, what are you doing as a business to create the conditions in which I, as a parent, am going to be able to come to work at your organization. Not only do I want to work at an organization where I believe in what the mission and the purpose of that organization is, but I physically need to be able to be there. In the earlier sessions, and even earlier, what Carol and Linda were talking about, these childcare deserts in the state of Missouri are ridiculous. We can't have 60, 70 counties listed as childcare deserts, and that was like before the pandemic. Out of however many counties we have, 115, 120 counties, that's just non-productive. It doesn't allow parents to engage as productive members of the workforce, and I need that talent. So am I going to be part of the problem, or am I going to be part of the solution? And I think the more I have certainly spoken with business leaders, and the more, as Linda mentioned, that this information has gotten out there about what is needed, the better off we're going to be. And by the way, a lot of these areas where these deserts are, whether they're rural or whether they're in urban constituencies that are populated by minority populations that are completely disadvantaged, that's just another strike against them. And I just refuse to sit back and say, that's someone else's issue. And I think a lot of other business leaders who I work with feel the same way.
114 counties plus the city that is a county, St. Louis. Linda.
I've heard this described by business leaders as being a 2-generation workforce challenge. So you've got workers that need access to childcare, and then you have children, that are going to benefit to become better workers by getting that strong start. So I love that term. And I read this, and I'm going to just share it with you. It said, access to high quality care is the single most effective tool to recruit, retain, and productivity. And it's like, childcare that you can rely upon that's high quality, there's a 20 to 30% reduction in absenteeism. There's a 37 to 60% reduction in turnover, 75% increase in retention, and an 80% ability to attract new hires. So those are great numbers. And also the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has great data about childcare breakdowns, but it is a multi-billion-dollar problem. So it is imperative that the business community is at leading this effort, because it will impact our economic health for forever. So
This is specifically to Tyler, since you have a multiple state perspective. Can you share a bit about the business community response, or your response in particular to COVID pandemic, and what have you learned to help the rest of us move things forward?
So one of the things that I was able to do early on during the pandemic was to galvanize a group of business leaders to try and bring test kits to the city of Kansas City. In a matter of hours and days, we were able to assemble, raise money, and bring 50,000 test kits, as well as a bunch of associated equipment, and then work through U.S. Engineering to set up a laboratory at the University of Kansas Health System to increase capacity for testing in Kansas City. And to me, that just wasn't about being able to do something quickly because of an emergency. What it really represented in my mind was this bias towards action. And we can lament everything that has or hasn't happened in the past, things that we did do or could have done better. But the fact of the matter is that motion is only moving forward, and time only goes in one direction. And so on these issues that seem rather intractable, I think we all have to remember that they were actually created by human beings, so we have the ability to solve them. And whether it's dealing with test kits as it relates to COVID, or whether it relates to how we're interacting with legislators and practitioners and parents and even the students themselves, to me, it gives me a great deal of hope that these problems are not beyond us. These problems are not things that are going to forever remain mysteries to us. But this bias towards action that the business community has is something that's a real positive. Now, on the other hand, I don't think that educators and administrators simply want the business community getting all up in everybody's business about how exactly something should happen. But the role that we can play is as a resource, as willing partners in the work that's being done. And so as we decide what we want to do when we move forward, whether it's through legislative frameworks or very specific initiatives in communities that all have different needs, by the way, we need to be there. We need to be engaged as a sounding board, and we need to take that bias towards action and actually make things happen. And so when Linda shows up in your office this year during the legislative session, I would ask that you really do give her your time, because she's not there as a proxy for some other business interest that I or a board member or a member of Aligned has. She's genuinely there to help solve what we all are perceiving as some kind of Gordian knot that, quite frankly, we just need to cut.
Thank you. Next question deals with differences between rural and urban issues. And just, 37% of the state is rural. That's 2 million people. We don't think of it in those terms, but it is. It's twice the size of St. Louis County. Of course, spread out over, 69,000 square miles. What are some of the differences and similarities between urban and rural challenges, first part? And then what are some potential solutions for policymakers and appropriators in what is shaping up to be another difficult budget year should we consider? Carol?
I thought you were going to call on the first. It's about the differences in rural and urban. I tend to know the rural situation, I guess. That availability is an issue. We know there are deserts, and affordability is also an issue. If you look at Representative Riggs, you discuss the 2 million people that live in the rural areas. If you looked at the median income for some of those counties, especially the ones that have deserts, my guesses are going to be a lot lower. And so you've got a situation where, as Sarah, gave her presentation on, recommendations on things to consider, from living wage and leave time and some of those situations, we are not, my community is not waiting on the state. No offense, you guys take a while sometimes to bring solutions. So we're going to try to solve our own problem. And in a rural area, we have We rely on each other. We have a lot of family members stepping up, especially this time during COVID. But our three-pronged approach is going to include existing centers, and it's going to include how do we open up more available spots? How can we hopefully recommend some changes into some regulations that make it a little bit easier to operate a daycare, and some of those things. And so we need your support on some of it, and some of it we can't wait, because the situation isn't getting better, it's not getting easier. COVID has definitely exacerbated it. If you talk to people who took leave from March, they used up sick time, they've used up vacation time, they're already in the hole trying to use 15 more days their employers have given them. It's a stressful situation. And so, you know, I'm sure the same is the same in the urban areas. And I'm sure we all know women are getting hit much harder. I mean, they're getting hit harder in the rural areas as well. So, you know, I don't have all those answers, and I know you don't either, but I appreciate that you're here today to work on them. And honestly, Louis, I forgot the second part of what you asked. So, I don't know.
Well, you covered plenty of ground, and from a rural perspective, part of it's just flat out distance.
Yeah.
And we're a nonprofit that provides pediatric nursing care for like a 5-county area because the county health departments don't have enough money to scrape together between the 5 of them to pay for a peds nurse. That's just something that's a fact. That's not my district. That's farther south. That's the type of thing we deal with every day. Same question then for Tyler.
So I won't pretend to represent all of the perspectives of all the various rural counties in the state of Missouri. I have traveled around and met with lots of people and spent plenty of time in a lot of those areas. And if there's one kind of common theme that comes to mind for me, is that it comes down to labor participation. It certainly comes down to offering job opportunities for people who want to participate in the actual child care that's going on. But it's also a way to try and ensure that the labor force that's available to work outside of the education system is there. I mean, I think the state of Missouri's unemployment rate's a little over maybe around 4.5. And a lot of those jobs, I think something that approaches 60% of the jobs that exist in the entire state, they're not remote work from home jobs. We're not San Francisco, right? Like we can't just like telecommute from our homes into our little tech jobs making apps. There's a lot of industry that goes on in Missouri. And so childcare and quality childcare becomes the backbone of our entire economy. That's particularly pronounced in rural constituencies where there are a lot of agricultural or manufacturing jobs or just jobs that do not involve that technology boom. And so, again, I don't pretend to be an expert on all of the details, but at the 50,000-foot view from a company that does engage in a lot of work down in Springfield and Joplin and, in Kansas City and all throughout Columbia, we see it. We want to be able to hire more people, and that involves taking care of kind of the fundamental, kind of Maslow's hierarchy. Are your kids going to be safe? Are they being taken care of? And if there's one thing I do know, parents in rural constituencies don't love their kids any less than parents in urban constituencies.
Well, we know that there are more childcare deserts in rural communities, especially communities that aren't really close to like a institution of higher education, whether it be a 2-year or 4-year college, because there tends to be, more jobs and there's more prevalence of care in those communities. And then in the urban areas, I think they struggle with finding quality care. So kind of different, but I want to share with you something that we did through the legislature and just kind of the effects and see if we can all figure out a way to fix it. But a few years back, we worked to put some funding in the foundation formula for pre-K seats, and it was phased in. And when the formula was fully funded, it triggered these dollars, which was wonderful. It was about, I think they estimated around $42 million for pre-K. And some districts like Springfield just grabbed that by the horns, and they knew how to do it because they were a big district with good property values. They had, buildings, and they could just draw those new dollars down. And I think they have like up to 600 seats now. Small communities that are, small schools, maybe they only qualified for 1 to 4 new seats. How are they going to start a pre-K program with seats for 4 kids? So there are a lot of barriers. And what happens is it's like the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, where you've got a nice big suburban district that has that property tax that they can draw upon, or they can do bonding issues if they need to build something. They have the ability to tap into those new funds. And so what we're trying to do right now is figure out what are those barriers that are keeping the smaller districts from being able to ramp up programs or even start programs. And then not to just, I have a positive little quick story to tell you. In Kansas City, the charter schools all worked together and they formed a cooperative, and they all had a little bit of pre-K that they could all draw upon. And they started their own pre-K program, and they were able to, just with this foundation formula dollars that we came through, and the language which Senator Wallingford helped to allow districts to contract with a private provider for pre-K if they didn't want to have their own program. Because of that, 285 low-income kids in Kansas City have high-quality pre-K. So that's amazing. And there are more and more schools that are drawing these dollars down. It's not enough. And then sometimes it's one of those things where they're not using it because they don't get enough to start a program. So there's just some challenges, and we're really trying to sort through those and figure out what those barriers are. So my ask to you is think about your district where you are, talk to your superintendents, find out, are they using these dollars for pre-K? If they're not, ask them why not, and let me know so we can figure out how we can make that policy stronger and just open that program up for more kids.
Thank you. To close things out, can each of you outline 2 or 3 takeaways our colleagues here should walk away with today? Carol?
Can someone else go first this time?
Linda?
Sure. I would feel really proud about where we are. I have a little graphic of a mountain and kind of where we started, where it was, I think in 2011, we had a ban on quality rating systems in the state where we couldn't even rate the quality. So parents had no way to assess where to send their kids for early care and education. We were able to remove that ban. We started a quality assurance report so we can start figuring out what a quality program would look like. We got pre-K in the formula. We activated it. We've got kids getting state-funded pre-K now. We've got a lot of federal dollars that come down to, with the federal grant, the preschool development grant, which was, over $30 million to do planning. There's going to be regional hubs across the state that are going to help coordinate services. They're not program providers, but they're going to help families figure out where they can get health and education and all of that. All of this is happening. We have a lot more work to do, but I think we're in a really great position. So my takeaway is just educate yourself on where we are, where we've been, and really start visualizing where we want to go. And let's just be a team and get there.
Sure. Number one, sort of in the wake of this pandemic, it's about rebuilding our economy. And I will go back to what Linda said about this 2-generation impact. I tend to refer to it as a triple net benefit. Not only does it benefit the children and what they are able to accomplish long-term through early childhood education, but it also benefits the parents by allowing them to participate in the workforce. And then the knock-on, of course, is all of that is eventually going to bring tax dollars to the areas where these programs are in place. And that's part of everything that, of course, James Heckman talked about in his papers. The second thing is that, access to high quality education, high quality early childhood education, I consider that to be the clean water issue of our generation. Fortunately, there's a lot of different things that we can certainly prioritize as a community and as a state. This, to me, is fundamental to whatever building blocks we want to place on top of it. It is absolutely foundational. And then the third thing is, it's really a takeaway is thank you. Thank you to all of you for engaging in this issue. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this dialogue. I will not disappoint you, and the business community will not disappoint you, and we will work very hard to engage in appropriate ways so that we are additive to the work that you're doing, not trying to detract from it. So thanks again.
Thank you for joining us, Carolyn.
I think a couple maybe practical takeaways, fix Nathan's Law. Tablet issue is huge, parents that get that, or that childcare subsidy piece, the tablet, it's a nightmare in my area. I'm like, let's just do away with it. I don't know, but it's terrible. Please fix that. And then 3, kind of going on, especially Tyler, like the business community, wants to take part. And there are areas of the state that have lots of businesses who are willing to engage. And so, I think having some kind of a public, but then the private business sector partnerships to solve some of these issues in areas that can do that, because that's going to strengthen, and that's going to be a win-win. And then there are other areas of the state that don't have a lot of business activity. They got a lot of farm activity, but they don't necessarily have those major industries in their communities. And so those are the communities that, if they don't have that business support there, are going to need more of the public support. So just, I would say, keep some of those things in mind. To more tailor to the different areas of the state. But I bringing the businesses in and having that partnership is going to be key, and can really probably help solve the problem, stretch dollars. Everyone has skin in the game. So.
Thank all of you. We'll have a round of applause. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. We are 2/3 of the way through. Everyone in the room, let's stand up. And if you're home, there's like 30 of you, or maybe 35 or so. Stand up, stretch. We all need to stretch. For those of you in the room, there's water over here. We are going to move to our next session pretty quickly here. But before we do that, Senator Arthur is going to share how and what early childhood means to her virtually. Senator.
Hi everyone. Thanks again to our last panelist and all of our panelists. Thanks to Representative Riggs for moderating, and thanks to all of you for joining us and for sticking around. Before I held elected office, I taught middle school. And each year I had students arrive who, on the very first day, had skills and scores that were several grade levels behind. And my kiddos, they struggled not because they were less capable. To the contrary, they were very precocious. But it was because they didn't have access to the kinds of early learning opportunities that we've talked about today. They got a late start, and then that gap compounded year after year. So it's possible that we can close that disparity between students who receive quality ECE and those who have no formal education before kindergarten, but it's difficult and it's expensive, and it can't undo the years of frustration that students experience when they feel like they're failing. So the good news is, we know a better solution exists. We know that early childhood education solves problems before they start. And here in Missouri, I'm really excited because as we've discussed, we have an opportunity to take significant action and do it right now. I have sponsored legislation to invest more money in early childhood education. I know that you all have legislative proposals that tackle so many of these issues as well. So I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers to help accomplish our goals. And I would argue that setting up students for success isn't a partisan issue. It's a value. It's a Missouri value that we all share. So thanks again for being here today, and I get to turn it over to Craig for our last panel.
Craig, I think you're muted.
Right, I think you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you. Oh. Try one more time. Yep.
Oh, it keeps coming on and on. I think we're green now.
Yep.
Our panelists are going to come forward. And Allison, if you could put up my couple of slides about Kids Win Missouri. I just want to give folks an introduction to Kids Win Missouri as we enter into our next time together. Kids Win Missouri, for those of you who don't know, is an advocacy organization focused around ensuring that every child has the opportunity to be successful, to be, thank you, Allison, you can go to the next slide, please. To be successful, happy, and ready to succeed in school and life. And so we do that through a collaboration of working through other organizations and with other organizations, but then also working to take the policy lead in some areas ourselves. And early childhood is one of those areas where we believe that we take the policy lead, but we try to do everything we do in an evidence-based way. We want to make sure that what we're doing is rooted in what are considered the best practices. And lastly, our last slide is just kind of the how we do what we do. And I really appreciate this graphic because it shows that we, and you all know this as legislators and staff, is that we can't do this alone as advocates. We have to have you all as legislators, as partners in this work. We also know that as an advocate, I am not a child care provider. I don't know what the struggles are, but I can work with folks who are on the ground. So we try to be that wheel that connects all of the cogs together. So with that, we will get started. I think we have, let's see.
We're missing Emily.
Emily, yes, thank you. And Emily is our last one. And so what we're going to do as we start is what this panel is really a focus on specifically what we're doing here in Missouri. And what we're doing here in Missouri are really good things. And that's why Representative Riggs started this process a year ago. And so what we'll start with is just going through our line of folks. And if you could introduce yourself, your role, a couple of minutes of what your work is like and what you're doing. And then we'll go into some Q&A and then hopefully have some Q&A from the audience as well. Jerry, you can start.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
I think so.
Okay. I'm Jerry Ann Yeagers-Brennicky with the Department of Social Services. I have two sections that are on my team. One of them is our work initiatives, and we run employment and training grants for low-income persons. And in that unit, we also focus on food insecurity and any of the wraparound supports that people need. And the other unit is the early childhood section. And in that section, we issue payments to subsidy providers. We also hold some quality contracts. And so you have the subsidy providers, we have after school programs, we have we have a whole host of things, and ultimately it ends up impacting tens of thousands of children. We are relatively new to this, and when I mean relatively new, I mean October the 20th was when we started with it. We recognized there was some challenges and issues with some of the things that were going on, and I very much know that people can't go to employment or training without childcare. So while it's been a bit challenging, we're up for the challenge because they go hand in hand. And we ultimately at Social Services want to give people the opportunity to become self-sufficient.
Excellent. Thanks. Pam?
All right, good afternoon. My name is Pam Thomas. I'm in the Office of Early Learning at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and I want to piggyback off of Representative Shields' aha moment that she had mentioned. And so I was trying to think of mine, and I don't think I have one because I grew up in a big family on a farm in Northeast Missouri, and I was the oldest daughter of many children. And so as long as I can remember, because I didn't like the outdoors, I was inside. So when I was 8 years old, staying home with my newborn baby sister because my mom was sick, and staying home from school and taking care of her. When I was 12, turning my living room into a classroom, teaching my younger brothers and sisters something along with their stuffed animals. And when I was 15, instead of going out on the town with my friends, I like to take care of my neighbors' kids. So I think also what molded me to want to have a profession in early childhood is as a young mom going to college and learning about early childhood and watching my first of 4 sons walk and talk and grow and learn. It kind of really made me want to stay in that profession. So early learning is a very important part of my life personally and professionally. I've been in the field for over 17 years. And I think right now our focus at the department is really to, our office goal is for every child to be ready for school. And we take that to heart. We're very passionate about that. So we are working on making sure that children can get access to screening at least once a year, preferably twice. Really looking at how we can have better access to high quality early learning opportunities, whether that be with a public school or a community-based program. If it's high quality, we want our kids in it. And I think the other piece we're really focusing on is when you want to have children ready for school, you got to have parents and family members that are ready for their child to go to school. So engaging families early and often on what their child's development means, what that means for them, natural learning opportunities where they can grow and learn every single day in their home and other types of places that children live and learn and play. So I think that's a really important part. I know the notes for today also talked about a key initiative and funding. So I want to just mention that even though we are in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, I think sometimes people think all of our money goes to school districts, and that's not true in early childhood. So we have Missouri preschool projects, and we have the quality assurance report that Linda mentioned, and those have both school district programs as well as community programs that we are funding and supporting that work. We also have the First Steps Early Intervention Program for children birth to 3 who have disabilities. We pay over 1,000 private providers for therapy services and special instructors that are through hospitals and other community programs. So I think that's one thing I'd really like for you to take away from today is that doesn't mean that we have all of our services in school districts. We really do reach out beyond into community programs. And then last but not least, our big initiative we're real excited about is we just secured, funding for our second year in our preschool development grant. I think Linda mentioned that as well. It is a 3-year, $33 million grant, and it is focusing on the infrastructure of early childhood. So we aren't paying for seats and we're not paying for advancements in slots, but we are focusing on data systems and professional development for all birth to 5 providers and looking at how we can have programs and teachers using appropriate tools so we really know where the child's skills and abilities are. So thank you so much for inviting us here today. Look forward to your questions and conversation.
Thanks, Pam. Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Van Shankoffen. I am the director of the Missouri Children's Trust Fund, and the Children's Trust Fund is a little bit different entity than some of my other colleagues up here in that we're quasi-governmental entities. So we are positioned by statute inside the Office of Administration, but I'm governed by an independent 501c3 board. Representative Cody Smith is on my board, Senator Jeannie Riddle is on our board, and Senator Jill Shoup. We take a really active role in public policy and systems development to prevent child abuse and neglect, as well as giving out funds throughout the state of Missouri to prevent child abuse and neglect. And so when you talk about what does CTF do that's specific to early learning, I think that I want to really highlight and focus on what CTF does for I think for a lot of times people didn't consider what we do to be early learning. But when you hear the presentation from Dr. Little, what she was talking about is everything about what the Children's Trust Fund does. Because when you bring a baby home from the hospital, you're not trying to teach that baby letters and numbers. What you're doing is creating a safe, stable, and nurturing environment for a child. And if a child has a safe, stable, and nurturing environment from the time they are born, they turn into a successful, happy, healthy adult. And when children are deprived of these very basic needs when they are young, it creates a lifetime of consequences for them. And it's not just about 3rd grade reading levels, it's about a full-time ability to live up to your God-given potential. And so what the Children's Trust Fund tries to do is to create opportunities to help parents be the best parents they can be, to help people who are living in poverty, who have experienced child abuse themselves, trying to disrupt the cycles of intergenerational child abuse so that every child who comes into this world has an opportunity to be who they can be. We believe that safety is the foundation of all of it. If you are not safe as a baby, as a 2-month-old, as a 3-year-old, then you will never be able to be the full person that you can be. And so that is what our work is all about. We focus on 3 specific areas largely, and one of those is home visiting. We believe that home visiting is one of the most evidence-based, proven strategies to help families and vulnerable families become successful caregivers. I have been so touched in my role and talking to young women and men who have experienced home visiting services and hearing from them firsthand what it's like as a 17-year-old to become pregnant. And I don't know about you all, but when I brought my babies home from the hospital, it was some of the most stressful, one of the hardest things I've ever done was to care for a newborn. Can you imagine caring for a newborn without family or support, without a husband to support you, without running water in your house, with these very basic things some people in our state don't have, and they bring children home to those environments, and home visitors can often help families to get the successful, stable environment, even in really rough circumstances. The other thing we work on, or we work on two more things, but the next one would be child sexual abuse prevention. And I will say that there is nothing more insidious, there is nothing more damaging that you can do to a child than to sexually abuse them. And a child that is being molested at home is not a child that can learn. And it is the most damaging thing you can do to a child. And yet what we have done, really, because adults, we are uncomfortable with talking about child sexual abuse, we turn away from it because it makes us sick to our stomachs, and it should make us sick to our stomachs. But our inability as adults to reckon with what child sexual abuse does to children has created an environment that allows perpetrators to continue to hurt children. And I think we've come to a point in our society where we have to say, we can prevent child sexual abuse. We need to explore interventions that can prevent child sexual abuse. We don't fund child sexual abuse prevention. The Children's Trust Fund is really the only entity in the state of Missouri, and we have a very small amount of funding that is dedicated to preventing child sexual abuse. And so we are committed to leading the way in learning and saying we are not going to abandon our children. We are going to do everything that we can to prevent child sexual abuse, because again, child sexual abuse does happen throughout the lifespan of a child, but particularly young children are very vulnerable and experience considerable amounts of it. Our final piece of what we do is child fatality prevention. And I have served on our state's child fatality review panel for several years, and I serve on the local Callaway County review panel. So I have seen way too many dead children in this state. And these are mostly kids in the ages of 0 to 3, and they're most predominantly babies. And most of the reason for that is that babies' bodies are uniquely vulnerable. You can leave an 8-year-old home alone for 2 days and nothing, they'll probably be fine. You leave a baby alone, don't feed them for 2 days, they die. You can throw a baby across the room and you'll kill them. You can throw an 8-year-old across the room and you're not going to kill them. Their bodies just can't withstand force the same way that adults and other children can, and then their caregiving needs are so high. And so we are about ready to launch an initiative to help prevent the child fatalities in the state of Missouri, and to galvanize people around this idea that our children are beautiful and precious, and from day one they deserve our investment. And so for me, early learning and what we do around early learning isn't sometimes what other people think about early learning, but it absolutely is. It is among this important spectrum of things that we do to support families so that children can thrive.
Thanks, Emily. Kelly?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kelly Dudley, and I am with the Department of Mental Health. I serve as their early childhood wellness expert. I'm new to Jeff City. I've only been in my position for about 1.5 years because the prior 17 years I was working in direct service. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I was thinking, as Pam was starting to talk about her aha moments, and a couple of others of you have, I thought of my first job straight out of college. It was as a kindergarten teacher assistant. And the defining moment of it was when I was trapped in a room with a 7-year-old threatening me with the teacher's scissors. And I had to de-escalate that situation and move out. And this was in a very affluent area of Minneapolis in a private school. So it's not what you would typically think of. And I went from that into case management for mental health. And I worked for several years, over a decade, in child welfare as a forensic interviewer and a mental health consultant with Head Start. So I've seen firsthand the things that Emily is speaking of. And when we think about our children, the most vulnerable population is 0 to 4. At the Department of Mental Health, obviously everything that we've talked about today has to do with mental health. And often I'm asked about, infant and early childhood mental health. What do you got, a couch back there that you're going to have them lay down and tell about their problems? Obviously, that's not it. We also use the term social emotional development. And so everything that we've talked about in brain architecture today, in those pro-social skills, in building attachment and bonding with their caregiver, in learning their emotions and how they're going to regulate those emotions, all of that is infant and early childhood mental health, which is one of the foundational developmental processes in this age range. And so it speaks to all future well-being for children. It speaks to their cognitive development, to their physical development, to their literacy and language development, to how they will be obviously in the workforce, as you've heard, and have future education. So that's what we're focused on, is the promotion of well-being. Unfortunately, there are children, about nationwide, 9.5 to 14.2% of children in this age range of 0 to 5 that will experience mental health diagnoses, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. We see depression in infants as young as 3 months old. And so there is a treatment element to that as well. The Department of Mental Health is to serve all of the population. So we're supporting parents getting substance use disorder treatment or mental health treatment, and how they're becoming parents to their children and looking how to support that better. And then of course we want to support the early learning process through mental health consultation and support to teachers. You'll see in the needs assessment that was done by the preschool development grant just a year and a half ago or a year ago, one of the biggest needs that care providers and education teachers and parents ask for is mental health support for their children. So we're looking at better ways to do that in our state.
Thanks, Kelly. Nancy?
Hi, I'm Nancy Shear. I'm the section administrator for the section for child care regulation. I've been in this role since October 1st of 2020, so not that long, but I have been working in the child care field for many years. I guess one of my aha moments of wanting to work in the state government has been when I was a director at a child care center in Texas, and our state lady, you might hear that term quite often, came in, and we were terrified of her. We said she was a drill sergeant. We all just, stood very still when she came. We were afraid what she was going to say, and I thought, I want to go in and help providers. I don't want to be that scary state lady. And that's what I am hoping that our staff do. We go in, we do licensed childcare centers. The goal for us is to ensure that the children have a caring and safe environment, because as we heard throughout this whole day, children can't thrive if they aren't in a safe place. They have to have providers who care about them. They have to have, safe environments. They have to have heat and water and, a place where they can, sit down and play and relax without, being afraid of where their next meal is coming from. So that is one of the things that I try to instill in my staff. Yes, we're going in there to regulate and ensure that these places are safe, but we also want to make sure that we are teaching providers and helping them and giving technical assistance. We might leave there citing them for several violations, but we can do that in a manner that isn't demeaning to them and help them, give them some ideas of how they can make corrections. There's lots of things that we can do. Rules are changing, here and there, but bottom line is we have minimum standards in Missouri. Our rules provide minimum health and safety standards. Over the last few years, we have been able to make some changes to those rules about safe sleep. Safe sleep is a really big issue everywhere we go. Children need to, infants have to have safe sleep environments. So that's been a great change that we've been able to a rule that we've been able to promulgate. There's been background screening rules promulgated over the last couple of years and statutes, surrounding that, where we are now requiring fingerprinting for all staff who work in childcare facilities. So that's a federal FBI check, so we know if you can't just come into Missouri from another state after, doing something horrific and then come into Missouri and work in a childcare center. So that has been a really good change over the last couple of years as well. There are approximately 3,000 childcare facilities that we regulate across the state. That's a lot, but as we also heard, there's lots of childcare deserts. We need to improve that. Our staff are ready to go out and license childcare centers as soon as we get applications, but providers are struggling in more ways than one. They can't find staff. They don't have the money. COVID has been a big hit on them. So we do need to improve the number of childcare facilities increase the number of childcare facilities that there are out there. Our staff investigate complaints. We work closely with some of my partners up here, the Department of Social Services. We investigate complaints. We also co-investigate with the out-of-home investigators with the Department of Social Services. We try to do that co-investigation. Although we're looking at different things, our staff are looking at licensing rule violations, and the out-of-home investigators are looking at strictly at child abuse and neglect. But we can conduct our interviews at the same time, and we can all get the information at one time rather than put a child or a provider and their caregivers, through that more than one time. There are times that we just can't, coordinate our schedules because everybody's very busy, but we try to do that and try to explain to providers what the difference is, because they may get a substantiated complaint from our staff, but then an unsubstantiated report from the out-of-home investigator, and then they're confused. So we try to explain that all at one time so they understand what our differences are. And so we work closely with them. We also work closely with the Division of Fire Safety. They do inspections at all child care facilities to ensure that those places are safe for children to be. If we might they have to go out annually, but they also will go out in between time if need be. Maybe there was a fire in a facility. Our staff aren't experts in knowing if that is safe now for them to continue to operate. So we'll send the fire inspector back out there just to ensure the safety of the building. We also work closely with the Division of Public Safety. The Division of Community and Public Health. So sanitation inspections, and again, they go out annually, but they'll go out in between, especially now during COVID. If there are, we're having issues with somebody's not, sanitizing correctly or whatever, we can, request those inspections so that they can get a little bit more help from experts out there aside from just our staff. So I think that, our staff, go out unannounced, but they also go out there to help providers for the most part. We aren't just there as the bad guy. We recently we got $10 million for childcare funds, COVID-19 relief funds, and we don't typically deal with money, so it was a big change for us, something that we had to quickly put together and figure out how we're gonna, receive all these invoices and get the monies out there. And it was kind of nice to be the good guy and, not always the regulator who's, out there telling them what they're not doing right. So we were able to, get some of those fundings out to providers to help them, with some of their PPE and other things that were COVID related. So.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
And thanks to each of you. I didn't set this up very well, but for the benefit of the excuse me, for the benefit of the body. So I've got the kitty crud. It's not anything. But when you have 2 children under the age of 3 who are at childcare all day, I apologize. I didn't set this up, the panel up very well, but for the benefit of everyone, when you think of early childhood in Missouri, these folks in front of you are truly the key stakeholders from the state level. And so it's really important as an advocate that I work with them, but then you all as policymakers to interact with them as well. And at the risk of moderator's discretion and maybe not making my panelists too happy, well, I would like to take my discretion and change questions a little bit. We've heard a lot of conversation today about access, whether that be availability of childcare facilities or the cost. And so at the risk of pivoting, if you could just talk a little bit about what you're doing in that space, in either space, or what you're seeing as a result of not having, say, access to care and how that could impact families. And so I won't call on anyone, because I'm throwing the curveball at you, but I would just open with that. Since we've talked a lot about access, I want to make sure folks know what we're doing as a state in this space. Because I know that we're doing a lot of really good things. There's always more that can be done. There's always work to be done, but thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, no problem. So from a childcare provider perspective, I mean, I'm sure everybody's well aware that childcare providers, like many other small businesses, that their world just kind of got turned upside down. And you know, from the subsidy provider standpoint, those decreased rapidly, as well as other providers throughout the state, knowing we already had deserts and that, you know, obviously got even greater during this period of time. And then coupled with the fact that, you know, many parents are staying home either to help their children virtually learn or cities have shut down centers or whatever is going on. So obviously there are many employers in Missouri on this side, right, that need people to work for them, and we engage with them on a regular basis. But then the child care provider on this side is having some major issues, even if that means like I'm going to be shut down for 2 weeks because of quarantine. So obviously supply and demand is not fitting well together. Social services did receive CARES Act funding, and we did try to help with this with the first round of funding that we had. And so we did things like job search, we allowed it. So if you were going to job search, you could job search and take your kids to daycare as long as you met the criteria. We changed the levels that you could come into childcare at. You know, you used to only be able to come into childcare at the very bottom, and then you could stay in there and transition out. And now there's different levels that you can get assistance, which helps more people qualify for benefits. We did some one-time payments, either for slots or if you served essential personnel. We paid providers for several months based on how many kids they were authorized for, so who they would normally serve instead of who they actually served. We also have now, we're now working on some other additional job search times, you know, 20% rate changes through the end of the year. And another one is the virtual grants. So those grants, there was $2.5 million set aside, up to $25,000 to grant. I mean, but we know some providers might come in at, you know, $1,000. So the hundreds is like the bottom part of it. But the goal with these is, and I should back up, we went and visited providers during the pandemic, just so you know. We went to St. Louis and we sat down with providers and we said, what's going on and how can we help? And so we went to the classroom, the virtual learning classroom, and we saw the lady there that had the kindergartner and the second grader and the fourth grader and the seventh grader trying to help them virtually learn and bounce from kid to kid to kid. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like we have to do something about this, right? Because we're paying normal ratios. We're paying 1 to 16 or 1 to 10 or 1 to 8 or whatever we're paying. And she's got 1 to 4. So, you know, visiting with the providers obviously has been very important, but we're hoping those grants will allow school-aged kids to come into facilities and their parents to either go to work or to go to training. Because I know anybody that has a child who has done any virtual learning, by the way, I have 5 and my youngest are 3-year-old twins, has done any virtual learning at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, Sunday afternoon, knows how challenging that this can be just in general. So really hoping that those centers will be able to use that grant funding to open up capacity.
Thanks, Jerry.
Oh, you got one
I
now.
got my own.
Oh, well,
I
very
got my
good. We
own.
don't have to share anymore, Jesse.
So I'm going to step back a little bit and just talk about from a parent's perspective. One of the things through the preschool development grant, because that is an infrastructure piece for our state that we've been focusing on, is let's talk about access to services and resources and referrals to appropriate places from a perspective of the family. Let's get family centric, because what we've been doing is kind of program centric. And so really kind of flipping that coin a little bit and thinking about how do families access information? Where do they go? What do they need? And so this past year, we worked with our state partners up here and developed a new website that's called earlyconnections.mo.gov. And it doesn't look like your typical state government website. It's kind of fun and it's got some color to it. And it brings in the best of what our state agencies do. So you'll see links out to different department programs, but the point of that being is 3 out of 4 times parents are online looking for resources. And just like Jerry Ann said, that's 10 o'clock at night, Sunday afternoon. It's not an 8 to 5 call someone. So we really got to think about a family-centric perspective of what do families need, where do they go, what are they looking for. So we continue to update that website with new resources and links out, getting lots of feedback about maybe links that aren't as family-friendly as they could be. So trying to put some money behind making that information easy to access, making the system really easier to navigate. The second part of that is we also know that families don't just get information online. They need places to go. They need someone to talk to. So we have to provide that second tier of support. And so like I think Linda had mentioned, one of the big initiatives coming out of that infrastructure is something we call regional hubs. And so that is basically looking at a community level, where are the areas that families naturally go for services, and how can we then take the existing services and supports in that area and better coordinate them so that families can kind of have a one-stop shop of where they would go to find all things about early childhood. And I think that is going to obviously take us a little more time than putting together a website, because we have programs and buildings and people and services. But our 2021 priority, we just sat down the other day and wrote out our priorities for the preschool development grant. One of those is community leaders and readiness for that type of a model. So we have had over 50 nominations of community leaders across the state that can really at that local level take a look at helping to coordinate those services. And by doing that, using the existing funds, using the existing programs we have, naturally make space if we're able to coordinate that better. I think the second part of that is those community leaders have to be both public and private. Someone mentioned that, and I think that's really important to have both sides. So looking at having a school district be one of those community leaders, but then either a private or community-based program that's that second or that partner leader in those areas. So we have the grant until 2023, and so our hope is that this year is going to be a lot of the resource mapping, contract mapping, fiscal mapping, ABC, and we'll do all kinds of mapping this year and really looking at some of those activities that will help us get us ready with that mindset of easier access and easier to navigate that system at a local level. Thanks, Pam. Always want to pass to you.
Okay, so I would just say, a question about access. I think most of the time people think about it as it's a child care issue, because obviously we have a child care crisis right now around access. I would say CTF, that's not the focus of what we work on though. So we work on home visiting. And so what we have been really working on is access to home visiting and equitable access to home visiting throughout the state. So we have 3 different state agencies that administer home visiting funds, and they all administer it in different ways. One of the things that the Children's Trust Fund did was to work with Representative David Wood, who left the legislature last year, but to secure an additional $3 million to make the Department of Social Services home visiting program statewide. And that was because you could get good home visiting services in St. Louis, but you might not be able to get it if you were in Trenton, and might not be able to get it if you were another part of the state. And really what we absolutely want is for any child and family that needs home visiting services to get it, no matter what part of the state you live in. We've also, Children's Trust Fund has been pretty vocal in talking about the fragmentation in our home visiting system with 3 different state agencies that administer home visiting, and a need for us to coordinate our services more effectively. So that instead of having 3 different home visiting programs, all those home visiting programs can come together and have a vision for how we meet the collective need of the state. And so, maybe we shouldn't have 10 different providers down in the boot heel. Maybe we have complete deficits up in the northern part of the state. Do we even know how many children that we're serving through home visiting? We don't. And so we have been working with a lot of our friends and partners, both the legislature and other agencies, to sort of start conversations about how we can do a better job of coordinating home visiting across our state agencies, so that there is access to all families who need that service.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Kelly, do you have anything to say?
Sure. Mine won't be quite as involved. I think from DMH's perspective, the expansion of telehealth services during COVID has been, a little bit of a silver lining, if we can say that about COVID. But it has created more access to families who wouldn't have traditionally been able to have that service, especially in rural areas, where we just don't have the professionals there in that space to provide those services. So telehealth has been very helpful. But I would also say from the coordinating board of early childhood's perspective, we've been working along with a lot of, well, I'm on that, Nancy's on it, Jerry Ann's on it, and then working very closely with Pam in the PDG project to create the strategic plan for Missouri and the early care and education. And there's three main goals that have come out of that strategic plan, which is building strong systems, bridging access and quality, and boosting supports. So right now we're a small board. I would love for any of you to ever visit. It's the first Tuesday of every month at 10 o'clock. And we've just begun to open up or begin to create work groups that will be assigned to each individual goal. So the first two work groups that we are currently open and working on creating will be the first one supporting strong systems, and the second one boosting access. Bridging access and quality. Sorry about that. And so beginning to look at some of these very issues for our state.
Thanks, Kelly. Nancy.
So of course, when the pandemic first hit, many childcare providers either closed temporarily. We still don't know how many are going to reopen. Some have remained closed because some parents just aren't bringing their kids back yet. Others have tried to open and they're struggling. But we have also put some waivers into place as far as for summer camps. We know that the virtual learning has really been a hot button, a big topic across the state for every school district, whether they started out all virtual or started out some in seat, some virtual. I mean, it's been all across the board across the state. Different avenues have been done. So there's been a waiver for summer camps that were approved as a summer camp to operate over the summer. The waiver has been extended, and there's been a waiver for them to continue to operate through the end of March under that summer camp exemption, provided they are seeking licensure. So we're trying to get people to become licensed, whether it's just for school age care or maybe they're now increasing their age range, to include preschoolers. So that's been something that we did. And then early on, we also had emergency licenses. Hospitals were calling us saying, we don't know what we're going to do. All the childcares are closed. We don't, we have nurses and doctors that are going to need care, and other hospital workers that need care. So we issued several emergency licenses across the state where there were limited things that they needed to do to get licensed quickly. Those licenses did not include infant care though. So it did have to be for 2 and older. Out of most of those that we licensed, only a couple of them actually ever got kids. So I guess, parents found other avenues. Maybe they had somebody that was staying home, an older sibling or a spouse, but we were surprised that those facilities were not utilized. I think 1 or 2 of them may have continued and are, now permanent, licensed. But those are some of the things that we've done during the pandemic. And then of course, working closely with DSS and, hopefully with the grants that are coming out for childcare providers, we will work closely with them and do whatever we can to, expedite any licenses that, are coming out of that. So we also work, with DESE when they have grants out there that, they want to get licensed. So we work closely with our other partners.
Awesome. Thanks, Nancy. One of the things that I always like to point out to folks is I like naming the tension. So there's always tension between the legislature and the state like agencies. And so I want to give you all the opportunity to talk about the misconceptions that either the legislature or more broadly, even the public think about the work that you do, and just talk a little bit about how we can combat that together. Because I think as advocates, as policymakers, oftentimes legislators are the intermediaries to figure out problems. And so what are those things that are the problems that you work with folks to solve that probably most frequently? It's probably the best question. I don't want to call Jerry Ann out first necessarily if you.
I get it done first, then
Go,
so-
Jerry.
yeah, it doesn't bother me. I like to talk. So I mean, I work for social services. Am I done? No, I'm joking. I'm joking. I mean, I work for social services. So obviously I can tell you, from walking into a community supervision center with some work we were doing with the Department of Corrections, right? We were coming in there from an employment and training perspective, like just want to make sure you have it all together. So you ultimately don't get incarcerated, right? And you can go back to your community, and the whole place shut down. There was not one person that was going to talk to me because we were from Department of Social Services and we took their kids, right? So that's a huge one, right? We take your kids, we take your money, like that's how we're perceived. But there is so much more to the Department of Social Services, so much more. I mean, we run, a lot of employment and training programs that are aimed at low-income families. We work on a lot of cross-division, cross-department projects on food insecurity. We engage with employers and we do massive outreach to these employers. That's a big thing we're doing right now. They'll call us and they'll be like, we need positions filled and they're good positions. And so we'll do mass text and email blast out to people in areas that we can get a hold of. I think from a public perspective, there is always, I mean, everybody's read the stories, right? You're using your SNAP benefits to buy the lobster. I mean, those stories happen. But the flip side of those stories is that, every person, there's people maybe that are doing that. I don't know, but there's also people that aren't doing that, right? They're pinching their pennies to buy food for their families. So you have both perspectives. And I think that the best thing that we can do to combat those types of perceptions is to share success, because I have hundreds and hundreds of success stories where people went through employment and training programs. They're no longer on benefits. Their kids are not on benefits. People have come out of the correctional facilities, went through one of our programs or one of their programs, and they're very successful in life. So I think it's really, it seems simple enough, but I think it's messaging and branding is what I really think it is at the end of the day. So that's probably just the biggest thing. I mean, we issue benefits and things like that. So people will always have a perception of social services and who we are.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
I want to share with you.
want to
Bethany.
echo Jerry Ann's comment, because I think just as a whole, the perception and we don't maybe do a good enough job sharing the success stories of things that are working. And right now, I think our early childhood, preschool, kindergarten, all teachers, I'll just say, I think are just trying their best. They're working their hardest. They're innovative. They're really trying to serve all of the children and students that they're responsible for. And so I think that we just need to do a better job of really asking for success stories, looking for success stories, and promoting those. So I agree with that with Jerry Ann. I think there's two other things come to mind. One I mentioned, and that is just really remembering that we don't just send money to school districts. We really do reach out to those private and community-based partnerships, and I don't think we showcase and highlight that enough. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I think the last thing is we often get the question, what do you do over there in the Jefferson State Office building? I don't know that folks know what we do. And so we have some of the most passionate, dedicated state employees for the Department of Education that you will ever find. And I think that what drives us is all children and the highest quality of education that we can provide, whether that is at age 1, at age 10, or at age 18. And I think that, we are always looking for different ways to measure something. We are always looking for a different way to provide professional development and support our teachers and leaders, whether that is at a director level at an early childhood center or whatnot. And I just think that's what keeps us coming back every day, is that passion that we have. And so those would probably be my three off the cuff takeaways.
Thank you.
Emily?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Craig, and actually I kind of a hard one, but I'm going to go ahead and speak my truth and just say it. So, I would say that I don't really perceive like tension between like the Children's Trust Fund and the General Assembly and the work that I do. I have seen tremendous amounts of support and believe that there are so many good people that want to help kids, and so I have been really over the years just buoyed by the passion and interest in our mission in the General Assembly, and that's really wonderful. I think if there's a tension, it is sometimes, it's a tension that I grapple with, and I think anyone who works with abused children who has seen the amount of child abuse that I've seen and that other folks have seen, is that I have seen both great people, and I have also seen great good. And so some of the folks, sometimes when you're talking about child abuse, you're talking about some really mean people. You're talking about some people that have done things that are beyond the bounds of what's acceptable, what's okay. And you've seen people do things that defy human explanation. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is that we have to support Missouri families so they don't get to that point. And so sometimes I don't think, or I see tension in the fact that I believe you cannot help children unless you help families. And so you cannot save that 2-year-old's life unless you help support that mother of that 2-year-old, even if that mother of that 2-year-old hasn't worked for the last 2 years, or is on SNAP, or is on welfare. And so how do we support families without enabling people sometimes for making bad decisions? And so how do we reconcile and wrap our heads around the fact that we can never get to that baby unless we give that mom a chance? And I believe, because of the work that I have seen, that a lot of child abuse is caused by people who are under extreme stress, that are living in poverty and horrible situations, that very much want to be good parents, but their lives are so crazy and chaotic. I see a lot of people who have hurt kids because they were horribly hurt themselves as children, and so they were never loved, they were never told they were beautiful, and so they don't know how to model protective parenting or prioritizing their children. And so I see our services and the support for child abuse prevention as offering a chance to children and offering a chance to families that want to help themselves. And some families we will never reach. We will never reach all families, and that breaks my heart. But I believe that the 17-year-olds out there that just got pregnant, that don't have family support, deserve an opportunity to become a great mom. And I think some people need more support than others, and I want our state to be the type of place that says, yes, we will give you a chance. So that's a bit of a tension that sometimes I experience with talking to members.
Thanks, Emily. Kelly?
This is kind of a challenging question for me. I think one of the biggest tensions that I see right now, well, twofold. The Department of Mental Health has done an extreme amount of work in trauma awareness, trauma-informed systems. We have a Missouri trauma-informed model that's on our website, and it's done great work. I think where we still see some gaps in that is, but babies, at least they were a baby, so it doesn't really matter because they're going to be okay because they're resilient. And there is some truth to that, but what we know about early childhood trauma during those key brain development stages is that it can actually alter the brain architecture. And so Dr. Lytle had made a comment, something to the effect of, each brain is working to develop to be the best brain in that environment. What if that environment is very toxic? And that's what we see often, is brains adapting to survive in their very toxic environment. And so making very tangible, I was on the phone with some other people in our department with a researcher and trainer in Australia who does amazing work, and we're hoping to bring her in to do some more training with our facility and then some of our partners hopefully as well. And she just talks about how, I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, I'm sorry. We were talking about the need for more tangible things for our early childhood providers to have, for our parents to have, to know how to protect their children, to know how to work with children who've experienced intense trauma in the early childhood classrooms. We see, if you're familiar with Walter Gilliam's work on preschool expulsions, the rate of expulsions from preschools and child care centers is astronomical throughout the country. And a lot of that is due to trauma response and insecure attachment attachments and things of that nature. And so we have a lot of tangible work that the department needs to do or that we can support. Part of that comes to our workforce. Our mental health professionals, I'm a clinical social worker. I never received, aside from maybe a class or two on early attachments and a theories class at the beginning of my graduate work, anything else about early childhood interventions or anything to that matter. And so when you're working with a licensed professional counselor or a psychologist, unless they've had explicit training in it, they're like, sure, I work with kids, but working with a 2-year-old and working with an 8-year-old are entirely different things. And so we're looking at if we can bring a mental health endorsement, an infant and early childhood mental health endorsement into our state so that we can assure that there's a professional workforce that has the competencies to work in early childhood development, specifically in regards to mental health. So I think those are some of the tensions that we're holding, is a really qualified workforce to work with this age population, and then understanding the impact of trauma during those early years.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly.
So, of course, is the section for childcare regulation. One of the misconceptions, I guess, is that we are just regulators and we don't care about the providers. We don't care about the health or safety of the children. Why can't you just let me fix that and not cite it and leave? And that's not true. We do care about the health and safety of the children. Every single rule that is in the rule book is to ensure the health and safety of those children in care. We can't pick and choose, okay, we're going to let this one slide because it's just your first time. But, then the next person comes out, that might be a new specialist. Okay, we're going to let that slide, just fix it, and we don't see that pattern. There may be providers who there is a pattern and we need to do some other interventions. We have facility review conferences. We call them in. We try to work with them to, correct rule violations. So, we've got comments that you guys just sit up there and behind a desk and, with your paper and just, try to come up with new rules to hurt us and not make us, we just can't afford it. And that's of course not what happens. Our staff do care about their providers. Our staff will bend over backwards. They'll spend hours upon hours, just helping providers with, what they need to do to get licensed. So our staff are very caring individuals. They aren't just, the paper and pen out there to give you a rule violation and be on their way. So I think that's a misconception. And of course, we only hear from providers who didn't like something that happened, so of the 3,000, there's very few that call, but I do get those calls sometimes that say, man, they did a really good job. I get emails sometimes that say, this person went above and beyond. I really appreciate it. Our staff, we've gotten, baskets and flowers at the office that we've had to send back because we can't accept those things, so we do good things as well. But, when there is somebody that is upset, that's when, we hear the most from them. So I think the misconception is that we are just not very nice people. We're just regulators. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. And for our last question, and then we'll wrap up. I'm just an optimistic person for those folks who know me. And so I want to end on that note of the optimism and the opportunity that is out there in early learning, in the area, in the work that you're doing. And so if you could just briefly name like something that you're the biggest opportunity that you're seeing in your space that hopefully as a state we'll be able to capitalize on.
So, I think that as far as the people we serve, we've also done a lot of things during this time. It's the whole we're better together, stronger together, we'll get through this together, right? Like that's the way we are, and that's what we're doing. And so we have been able to just make so many connections with other agencies that hopefully will help the local communities and has helped the local communities. But above and beyond that, what we've seen providers start coming together and being a voice themselves. And that makes it much easier if there's a consistent voice coming to us. The last thing that I really see from providers as businesses, an opportunity for us is to give them resources on being a business. We do have some providers that are very, very business savvy, but we do have some providers that we are looking to potentially coordinate with other agencies on how to be a business and stay in business long term, because we know we need providers. We know that we need childcare businesses throughout Missouri.
So Craig, when you asked that, two things came to mind. It's never one, it's always two or three. I don't know why, but two things came to mind. One, we are more similar than different. I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have, as you heard all of us talking about the safety, health, and education of young children. It is our passion. So I think I see us this year focusing on how we are all wanting the same thing and moving in that same direction. So I keep saying we're more alike than different. Let's stop talking about our differences. Let's start talking about where we have that common ground. I think the second thing that comes to my mind, if I could channel Maya Angelou, is you do the best you can do until you know better, and then you do better. And I think we are at the stage that we have done the best we can do until we know better. We know better. And so I really see 2021 as also being the year that we do better.
I just think that we have an incredible opportunity right now. I think that we are seeing more teamwork and discussion around the issues of early childhood in the state of Missouri than we've ever seen. So I think we are on the cusp of doing really special things for kids. And I think we are on the cusp of seeing more money, more investment in kids. And I think, like Pam said, we are trying to do our work smarter. We are trying to do our work in collaboration, and there's a whole lot of unity around this issue. And so I just want to close by saying that I think teams are everything. No one person can do anything, and teams are essential for what we want to get done for kids, and that the members of the General Assembly are an incredibly important part of that team. And you can make a choice in your career to focus on kids or to focus on other things. And I'm just going to ask that the folks that are here today in this room, the folks that are on the call, that you choose to make children a priority. And that if you work with advocates and you work with the executive branch and we focus on where we can agree, we can do tremendous things for kids, and we can really change the lives of so many children in our state, make them safer, make our educational system better, because it all begins at birth. And so I think that we've got a tremendous amount of opportunity for working together.
I agree with everything that's been said, and so I'm trying to think of something new and different. But I think one of the things that I'm hopeful about is I hope that we are going to be bringing new voices around the table. Not to point out the obvious, but we're all 5 white women up here talking about this for our entire state. I live in Springfield, which is the smallest community I've ever lived in. So I can't speak to a person of color's experiences. I can't speak to the rural experience. I can't speak to a lot of experiences. And for the coordinating board for early childhood, the work groups, the interest forms that we've sent out specific or special invitation to people of color, to different ethnic minorities, to rural populations that are not around our tables right now, because we really do want to hear the variety of experiences that Missourians have, that we're not getting that voice because of our natural limitations. And so I think that that's an exciting opportunity that we have this year, is to hear more voices and partner with more people.
So one of the things that I really look forward to is really hearing from providers, the good, the bad, the ugly, in a professional way. You know, I can't help somebody if I don't know what's wrong, and I can't say I can fix everything, but, you know, I will listen and I will do what I can. And working with our partners here, I have learned so much just since October, sitting on calls that I had no idea we all did all these same things. You know, some of them, it amazes me. So I think working together with everybody, and now knowing that it's not just my team here doing this work, that we have support across the board. So I'm really excited to see how that can, you know, will come together and change in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. And if we could give our panelists a round of applause. So as I turn it over to Senator Esslinger to close us out, just a final announcement. I want to thank you all for taking 3 hours. You all could have been home, and I'm grateful. So I just want to say thank you for those of you who are here, those of you who are online with us and have stuck with us. Senator Esslinger, I will turn it over to you. Look for a post survey of the event to come out by email in a couple of days. And with that,
Thank you so much, and again, the folks that are staying in and hanging in on the phone right here, thank you so much. You know that this topic is important. We've heard it's foundational, it's what makes a difference in our society, it's what makes a difference overall across our state. I can tell you that my aha is when I used to run a little video school system down in Theodosia, Missouri, and we did not have daycare, we did not have any kind of child care. I had teachers I wanted to hire, but they had no place to go with the kids. And so what we did, we braided everything we could. We took Head Start, parents as teachers, our ministerial alliance, everything we could to come together to try to solve that problem in that little bitty town. What I'm asking you to do today, take away from this meeting, is you've heard so much about the opportunities that are out there, the things that we're doing as a state, the focus and direction that we're going. But we have, as legislators, need to look at our districts, our particular districts, our counties that we represent, and do that analysis. Where are you as a county? What's going on with this population of kids? And from there, which I loved hearing, the grant that we have that's doing that landscape analysis, and we're going to have those community hubs. If we become aware as legislators and bring people to the table to talk about this issue, then we have the resource of what is out there, what can we do to access? And we can start doing what we said, the gentleman was spring said, bias to action. That's where we are now as a state. We have to convince people it's important. We have to get the right people to the right tables. Now it's bias to action. And I'm looking forward to the next few years. Thank you to the panelists, Craig, and thank you to all of you guys for sticking with us here. Awesome.
thank you. Thank you all very much. Safe travels.